Thank you, everyone. So we'll have now questions to our speaker. We've got a roving Hugh with the, there he is with the roving mic. So if you would like to ask a question, just put your hand up. I will select, and then Hugh will, so you don't start asking until he's actually arrived with the microphone. That would be good. So yes, is there anybody who'd like to start us off? Yes.
I wanted to ask this to make him run all the way across this. Frederick Buechner said, our vocation is where our deep joy meets the world's deep hunger. You talk quite a lot about our calling, the personal side of it. Well, I wonder if you could say a little bit about how that fits with the needs of the world.
So, I think that it is only in that meeting that I think there's a real sense of joy and vocation, not just where I found something I love to do, but I found something that draws me and that I can give, I can meet something. And I suppose that quote is still on the bead side of my understanding of vocation, where something that's in me to do meets a need of others. And it wasn't, you might say, well, there was in the Middle Ages a deep need, the world's deep hunger for learning. So in some sense, Bede is meeting that. But sometimes I think meeting the world's deep hunger, so I think the normal case is our deepest joy meeting the world's deepest hunger. But I think that sometimes when we're put in a situation like Romero, where addressing the world's hunger is not our joy. We just have to do it anyways, and we just have to do it in a way that doesn't suit us. But I agree that I do see the kind of mix of it. The sort of normal case of vocation is some kind of coming together of an inner and an outer, both my abilities, my desires, my joys, and what my community or the world needs and demands, and also an inner and outer in the sense of what I sort of think I might be like, and then what other people ask of me and tell me. So I didn't actually talk about that in the talk, but the sense that it's not just introspection that leads to a sense of who I am and what my gifts are, but there's a lot to do with what people ask of me, what they see in me, what they tell me that I can do.
Vocation has been talked about in very much the singular term. Do you think that people have perhaps more than one vocation? So you might have the vicar who also writes a book or writes books. You might have the teacher who's also a lay reader. And then also I was talking to Godfrey over coffee, and that whole sense actually for some people having a family as a vocation, which you hold alongside perhaps a ministerial vocation as well. So is it just in the singular term, or do you think people have multiple vocations?
I suppose that I think about a coming together of our multiple strands of one vocation, I suppose. So I suppose on the deepest level, I think we're integrated people, and the different things that we do, that we're most fulfilled if there's an integration of the different things we do. So if I said I'm a mother and I'm a teacher, and the two things have nothing to do with each other, I feel that wouldn't be an image of human fulfillment. Whereas if I say that there's a teaching going on in my maternal side, and there's a nurturing going on in my teaching, and that they're all woven together, I think in terms of a kind of ideal case of vocation, the things come together. But life is not ideal, and we're fractured people, so it doesn't mean that. But I suppose if you're saying what's the very model, then the vicar who writes a book, that there's some expression of their ministry in the book and some expression of their learning in the ministry, and things are integrated, I suppose.
that we can't say that everyone can follow a particular vocation where their desires meet the needs of the world, because of the evil in this world and affliction and all of that. And that kind of troubled me in some way. And I was thinking about, we are a faith that preaches resurrection life. And where might our vocation go kind of beyond the grave? And where do you see the cross in relation to a vocation as something that has its fulfillment beyond this life?
So yes, I think ultimately I believe that God's gifts are not thwarted. God's goodness is not thwarted. We see it being thwarted in a lot of ways in this life, so we have to trust in resurrection, in things beyond what we can imagine, in ways in which people will be fulfilled beyond how we can think. There are some kind of academic or theological trends that say we should be not too otherworldly. We need to just focus on this world and appreciate what's in it and take very seriously our role in this world, and we shouldn't trust too much in, pie in the sky, things being made better. And I kind of go the other way, that of course we have to do everything we can in this world, but it is so far, there are such cases of people not coming to fulfillment and nothing like it, that we have to trust in something utterly unimaginable in the resurrection, I think. And meanwhile, we have to work as best we can to allow people to fulfill their vocations to some degree, even in this life. To go back to the previous question about multiple vocations, sorry, I just had another moment to think about that. I think, we are one person before God. And so if it's hard to imagine God giving you a separate, disconnected list. There is a kind of unity, but we can't always live out our life. We have to struggle sometimes with the non-integration of things. But seeking vocation, I think, is partly seeking integration, I suppose.
Tapping into your specialism, do you see a link between vocation in all the senses that you've outlined, vocation fulfilled or frustrated? Do you see a connection with that and Balthasar's concept of the egodrama versus the theodrama?
So I did consider drawing on Balthasar, who has some very evocative notions about each of us taking our role and becoming ourselves when we're given our role, our dramatic role in God's theodrama. But I decided not to, because there are too many ways in which I slightly worry about him, including the fact that I'm not sure he makes space for frustrated vocation. But it is a very beautiful image in its way that Balthasar has. So if I can try to evoke it briefly, so the word person etymologically originally comes from a mask that is worn in a drama. So a person is a persona, it's a role, etymologically, originally. And Balthasar sort of plays on that to say that we become a person when we're given our role in God's great drama. So as we take on what we're supposed to do, that's only then do we come to ourselves and come to be persons. And so the person and mission go together. And it's quite beautiful language, but I couldn't go all the way with Balthasar because of some ways in which I think he's just gets it slightly wrong. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, Dan.
I wonder if you could help us as we're thinking about the year of vocation across the diocese, and we'll be having many conversations with people and putting services together to assist or help with this. Reflection really on what you think the biggest challenges are within our own human condition about recognising our true vocation, and what we might be able to do as a diocese in our individual situations practically to assist and overcome this.
Oh, it's a good question. So one thing I presume that'll be central to what you'll be doing anyways is many of us have a way of thinking about our secular life and then our Sunday life, and they're kind of separated. And I was sort of hinting at this in my talk that while people in preparation for ordination spend a lot of time thinking and discussing what's their vocation, most of us are not used to, most ordinary Christians aren't used to that. So one thing is to get people to take their lives, the whole of their lives before God, more seriously, not in terms of are you praying enough, are you following the rules, are you being a good person, but is there a particular thing that God wants you? So it's an interesting thing about vocation that it's not, that, or at least as I would understand it, and maybe in a kind of Ignatian tradition, that you're discerning God's will in a particular case, not from a general rule. So to get people to take their lives seriously enough from the point of view of their religious beliefs, that they say there could be a particular, at any one point, particular ways that God's drawing you. That's not just saying don't steal from the office and so on. So that would be one thing. Self-protection, maybe standing behind my own lectures, my worry that I might be following the bead path and missing the Romero call because we instinctively turn away from suffering, from difficulty, from loss. So that would be another basic human thing that it seems something which involves suffering can appear to us as a non-option. So although I'm very much against saying suffering has to be part of the life of discipleship and you need to go find it, we do also have to find a way of saying just because something is hard doesn't mean it's not the right thing. So that would be a second thing, standing in the way of getting people to do that. A third might be excessive humility, I think, which goes back with the first, which is, I'm not one of these special people. Especially affecting women often, or probably people from disadvantaged backgrounds, that God can't have a particular thing in mind for me. Those are first thoughts that come to mind. Do you have any other suggestions yourself?
I think very much about humility and this idea of not being worthy somehow, especially when it's expressed in the context of church. And I guess encouraging people to, as you say, ask the question of yourself about what has God done that is good within you and God calling you to, and not be fearful. I think one of the big messages we have really in the Christian faith is to banish fear. Perfect love banishes out fear and brings hope. So I would say focusing around that, if that helps.
I'm a member of a religious community as well as a parish priest, and I'm wondering if you could apply these two paradigms of Bede and Romero to the call to celibacy.
Well, probably I should turn it around and ask you to do that. I mean, am I allowed to do that? Go ahead.
Well, you're asking about a call which is fitting who you are and integrating you, and a call which disrupts who you are. And in a sense, the call to celibacy could be either, could be both. When you're discerning a call to celibacy, well, first of all, I don't think in the Church of England we talk enough about celibacy as a valid call. And that's a little crusade of mine. And that means, how do you discern that? And so I'm very interested in this Bede-Romero oscillation, because I think that's very relevant to how people in our community, we are providing a lot of priests for the Catholic Church, and that's unusual. So there are young people who are embracing celibacy with joy, and yet are they also discerning the disruption, the suffering, the sacrifice that will come with it?
Yeah, it's interesting because I turn the question around because I don't have experience of it, and I've never asked the celibates I know that question about celibacy. But my first thought would be it could be either. For some people, it could be this will be the path of fulfillment for various ways. Even marriage obviously involves forswearing all others, so it involves giving up. But celibacy could be parallel to marriage this is the pattern in which I will most come to myself and most develop. Or it could be more painful for some. I mean, the worry on the Roman Catholic model is people have to embrace it who really aren't called for it, and so it deforms, could deform people, without enhancing. But yeah, I shouldn't go into that again. I'm an amateur.
Can I say thank you very much for your address? I found it personally very helpful. But inevitably, in a sort of theologically diverse community, one of the questions you ask as you listen is, where is this person coming from? And if my memory serves me correctly, I think you were introduced as the Catholic Professor of Theology at Durham University. And so my mind then thinks, does Durham University have a professor for Orthodox studies? Does it have a professor for Reformed studies or liberal studies in theology? And then perhaps, if I may, at a slightly more personal level, within Catholic theology, do you see yourself as a teacher of it, as a defender of it, as a pioneer within it? So, in a sense, it covers your own personal vocation.
Right. Oh, okay, yes. So Durham University's theology department was traditionally all Anglican. So the first innovation was to have a Center for Catholic Studies, of which the first part was the Bede Chair of Catholic Theology. But then actually it's been imitated. Now there's a Center for Anglican Studies, and there is a Chair of Anglican Studies. So it's basically the limitations of funding and entrepreneurial. Nobody would be against having a Chair of Orthodox Studies and some others. So that's a kind of contingent finance-related question. How many different chairs of different positions, sort of different kinds of study do we have, or different kinds of theology? I guess mine is unique in that I'm the only person who has to be a Catholic to hold my position, because it's not the Catholic professor of theology, but it's the professor of Catholic theology, so I have to be a Catholic. And there's the canon professor, the Van Mildert canon professor has to be an ordained Anglican and is the son of Bishop Stephen here, my colleague. So there's a kind of parallel there. I'm avoiding the personal question, you can see, as long as I can. So within Catholicism, I consider my vocation to be to the church, but to the church which I think of more in terms of the laity than in terms of, supporting the hierarchy as such. So I suppose I think of it being that there are, as one element in my own spiritual life, there are questions I struggle with. I've had the training and the capacity and the support to develop resources that help me clarify those struggles and move on in some way. And I'm very upset that my fellow Catholics and Christians don't have these things. So doing what I can to make that available to, how shall I put this? I think there's a particular pastoral role for the intellectual life, and it's a therapeutic role that we get stuck. It's not that I think the intellectual life is the highest part of the Christian life, or is identical with piety, or that everybody should do it as a form of contemplation, but the way in which I tend to think of the theological role myself, and I know other people do it differently, will be there are things that impede us in our spiritual life because we get stuck on certain questions, and there's a kind of careful intellectual work that helps move that on and move us unstuck. So one question that I'm worried that we get stuck on is the role of suffering in the Christian life, and so that's swirling in the background of this particular talk. So the Bede Chair has built into it a 20% outreach to the local Catholic diocese. And I find myself more sense of fulfilling the vocation when I'm doing the outreach than when I'm teaching undergraduates. That might just be because undergraduates, you're not allowed to do faith-seeking understanding with undergraduates because they could have no faith. You can't presume. So there's a kind of extra layers of distance. So it's the beginning of an answer. my colleague constantly, who runs the Center for Catholic Studies, constantly articulates what we do as critical constructive theology, and I think I'm quite happy with that, that it's serving the church, but not by defending it or repeating it or making it beautiful, but by looking at its problems and trying to constructively help address problems within the church. And for some, this might be problems like clerical sex abuse. For me, it's difficulties that individuals come across. What's the doctrine of the Trinity doing? Am I missing something? Anyways, that's roughly how I see my vocation, I guess. And that includes teaching and speaking and writing. And for me, writing is a painful part of the vocation, so I often, when I think vocationally, I think I should get on with my writing, because I don't get an immediate sense of satisfaction, because nobody says that was nice when I write something, but long term people tell me it was useful, so I think listening to the outside world, I think there is some value in this, even though I feel stupid when I'm trying to write. So, yeah. So there's little elements of suffering in that vocation, but I'm more, somebody was asking me over coffee, I do see myself as fundamentally on the Bede model, that I'm lucky that so far there's a kind of match between something that I can contribute and gifts and circumstances that have come together to allow me to contribute that.
I too would like to thank you for your address. The question I have is, it seems probable to me that the Romero understanding or approach to vocation is attractive to a lot of Christians, because it retains more obviously a distinctive Christian understanding of vocation. There's not that many folks in the world around us who aren't Christians talking excitedly about their vocation to suffering. Whereas with the Bede model, the world around us is constantly talking about self-actualization, living with integrity, issues of identity, all those sorts of things. So I wonder if you could, if you've got any tips, or if you could comment on how, when we talk about a more a Bede understanding of vocation, that we make sure that we retain an explicitly and obviously distinctive Christian approach and voice as we do that. Because I think we all obviously would want to do that, but I know from personal experience that it's very easy just to slide into something that's relatively indistinct from what many other people are saying in self-help books or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that the fact that we might not be super different from self-help books is a problem in terms of being interesting and setting afire young people. But if you accept this line from Thomas Aquinas that grace perfects and doesn't destroy nature, then you might say that there shouldn't be a huge difference between a Christian vocation and what people could understand anyways. But there'll be some really important slight differences, I think. There'll be moments, my sense is there'll be moments when we remember that even though fulfillment might come, that's not the purpose in itself. That we have to put up with brokenness or loss. So I think, I don't have a good, this is why I'm an academic and not a journalist or a writer of inspiring kind of self-help books. I'm not sure that I have a quick, easy way to make that difference. I think you've put your finger on a really interesting point. I think that in my experience, the people that I admire, I think they're often they're just slightly different. But the slight difference makes all the difference in a way that it's a Christian vocation rather than just a career that they're working out. So, for instance, I mean, this is an odd way to describe it, but I knew a French theologian who had a period running his faculty, and he had to take on very difficult problems and fight people. And I noticed that between one visit and the next, I would see him every couple of years, he had returned to smoking. And he'd given up smoking between an earlier visit and a later one. So I said, "You're back to smoking." And basically he said it was from the stress of what he'd been going through. And he said, when you accept a role, you accept the costs of the role. So the cost was that the stress had been so great that it put him back to smoking. So yeah, I'm not, but to me this was a kind of moving thing that he just lightly said. You take on, basically you carry the cross when you accept that something is of value that you need to do as part of your vocation. So I think that the differences are slight, and it's a rhetorical or a presentational thing how to make them as visible. I mean, they're both slight and profoundly significant. The difference between what does it look like if I'm just trying to self-actualize and what does a genuine Christian vocation look like.
Could I just follow that up, that question? I mean, I suppose with the Romero type vocation, as you characterize it, that's very obviously sort of patterned on the life of Christ down to his sort of final celebration of the Eucharist at the time of his martyrdom. Is there any way that we could see how might one sort of more explicitly see what you talked about as the bead type of vocation as actually Christological in some sense? Is there anything in the life of Jesus or in the Gospels that it takes up?
Do you have ideas for that? I mean, the obvious thing is what was Jesus doing before he started his ministry, but I'm not too happy with that. Anybody got any suggestions?
Model of wisdom.
I think so. But the question was specifically Christological, and I suppose we can attach Christ to wisdom. But if you go for the wisdom literature, for Proverbs, for everything which points to God as creator, then you can begin to explain the bead narrative. The sort of but I think it's a good question. I'm not sure that I know how to do it really effectively.
Yes, we've got one down here.
Well, perhaps just following up on that one a little bit, could you talk a little bit about Jesus and his vocation and how that developed in his life, especially perhaps in his relationship to the Father and the Holy Spirit?
Before I do that, I've now figured out my answer to Edwards, which is, there's the line about when we eat and drink, they complain, and when we fast, there's a time for fasting and there's a time for eating and drinking. So there's a sense of seasonality, maybe, in Christ's life. So it's a beginning of an answer. So of course, lurking behind everything I've been saying is the presumption that all of our vocation is to follow Christ, and that Jesus followed his vocation, and that one thing that strikes me about the stories of Jesus is the constant trying to escape the crowds. So there's a sense in which he knows he has to be there, and he's torn between the sheer volume of need and of people coming from him and responding, compassionate responding, and the need to rest in God and to go apart. And then there's stories where he goes apart and then the crowds follow, so he goes back to compassion. So there's this sort of vacillating. So there's this sense of Jesus is driven by the Spirit. He has a particular ministry. He knows he's going somewhere. Whether he, there are different views about the knowledge of Christ, whether he knows that the resurrection's coming in the third day. I tend to presume not. So he knows he's being driven towards something cataclysmic. And Romero, the parallels are very strong. Romero even had 3 years of this sort of ministry as an archbishop. But he's afraid. He doesn't want to go there. He goes anyway. So there's a sense of vocation there as directly being led, as responsive, as drawn out of the closeness of the relationship to the Father is what makes possible this ability to move towards one's own destruction, I suppose. But that there's a kind of difficulty in it because of this, you know, everybody's coming at him all the time in the crowds, and how's he managing it, and trying to retain that balance. So those are random thoughts that come up in response to that. But there may have been a completely different line that you were wanting to pursue.
That's really interesting. I often think about these key moments where, you know, the obvious ones like, or perhaps the boy Jesus in the temple and the baptism and the transfiguration. I always think is a very sort of perhaps overlooked slightly, very significant moment.
Yes.
And then Gethsemane.
Yes,
you know.
so the Gethsemane is, yeah.
I mean, do you think that there's a progression there, or you know, and how does that relate to perhaps our key moments in terms of discerning vocation?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm not sure this is an answer to that, but another thing is I suppose there's friendships there, right? Martha and Mary are his friends. There's a lot in the background implied to make everything possible. You know, family relationships, friendships. It's hard to know whether we need to say that we can expect our lives to have absolutely key moments, Gethsemane moments, or whether in those stories we see a distillation, for what for us is a distillation of the whole. I think that some people will have key moments, will be able to narrate their lives like that, and some people may not. And I'm not sure that having a smoother life, or not having radical breaks in your life, or moments of great change automatically means that it's not following Christ. I mean, one thing about Bede is, so you can say that all of Christ's disciples are called away and called out, but Bede is in an already Christian society where he's starting in the midst of a life of prayer. So if you're already there, how does this called outness work? It might happen, it might not. So I suppose this is why I spent a little while saying, is Romero the only true Christian vocation? Because there's many ways in which he just seems a better fit, the struggle and so on. But I think that if we believe in the goodness of God as our creator, then we have to resist that. That was...
Should we just have one more? Thank you.
So vocation as a calling out. Understandably, we often speak of vocation in terms of a vocation to something. And in doing that, we'll often focus on an event, a moment in time, a change that takes place. I think sometimes also, though, we would do well to reflect on vocation as a calling from, and how there is that transition almost, and how, to what extent, we might talk in terms of a vocation from something, but not necessarily to something. How vocation can be seen as an ending, not only a beginning, or is a precursor to that beginning. And that might be pertinent and indeed instrumental in terms of how we as a diocese reflect on the vocation. What is God calling us from, as much as what is God calling us to?
So would you be thinking about, say, from complacency, or from abuse, or from alcoholism, or that sort of fromness, or can you give...
It comes from certain cultures, from ways of being,
right.
That lead to ways of doing.
Right.
It could also be organizational, how we structure our life,
right.
what we let go of, that we
Right.
may be freed up to do other things.
Yeah.
But there is that time of letting go.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, and I think what you're implying is that when you let go, you might not know what you're going to hold on to next. You can't say, I'm going to hold on to this thing until I've got all worked out the rest of my path. So there are things that you realize you need to give up, or you need to renounce, or you need to change. And certainly with the Romero story, I think that would fit quite well, that there's some sense in which what he let go quite suddenly and rapidly after the death of Rutilio Grande was a kind of holding on to a certain kind of safe, conservative church position where he kept everybody happy. and he didn't break any rules, and he didn't stand out. And what he moved into was a very confusing situation, which he remained confused by. Romero seemed to remain quite confused, or struggling, listening to lots of different people pulled in lots of different directions. So vocation might not be a vocation to simple clarity. It might be to risk and to letting go of safety, I suppose. That would be, yeah.
Okay, just one final. Did you have your? Yeah, we'll just have one final one over there.
I work as a hospital chaplain. I spend a lot of time with people who, due to the change in their circumstances to do their health, are not able to do anything anymore. And a lot of the talk has been about doing what God wants us to act on in our lives. I mean, I think relating to the previous question, that letting go, actually being able to have a vocation in some sense of being unique in the presence of God, and not the action not necessarily being a possibility.
Yeah.
People feel that they're not able to be a Christian in the same way once they're taken out of their sphere of where they feel their vocation has been due to ill health. I wanted to know some reflection on that.
Yeah, no, I was actually conscious of that as I was writing, that as soon as you talk about vocation being my fulfillment and meeting a need in the community, what do you do with people who are incapacitated, who if we're lucky, we're all going to grow old and lose our capacities. It's something I've been doing some research, which has been put me in a lot of conversations with a group of elderly Catholic sisters, mostly elderly, and it's something that some of them struggle with, others seem to handle beautifully. What's my sense of myself now that I no longer have an apostolic ministry, they would say. I guess the relationship to God and simply our being is ultimately more fundamental than anything we do. And the challenge when we have to give up doing is to go back to that most fundamental thing, I suppose, or So I think there was something slightly wrong in my whole presentation of vocation, because it was all about activity and the vocation to, in a sense, be a particular creature is valuable in itself, even if that creature is diminishing or limited. A particular person called into being by God. So yes, so thanks for raising that.
Good. I'd like to thank Karen very much for wonderful lecture to us today. She said very, very modestly, I've written it down, she said, nobody says that was nice when they read my writing. And I think I wanted to kind of query that, because I think it's very nice reading your writing, and particularly nice to listen both to the lecture and to the very open and honest way you've helped us with some of the questions around vocation. So many thanks to you for a wonderful first keynote address.